May 1943, 20,000 feet above Germany. The sky is white and gray and layered like torn paper. Inside a wall of thick cumulus, visibility collapses to zero, and the world becomes an engine's vibration and a pilot's heartbeat. A flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, heavy, rugged, brutally overbuilt machines, climbs blindly through the moisture. Radio discipline is tight, no unnecessary speech. Every man knows that outside this cloud bank somewhere German fighters are waiting. The pilots can't see anything except rippling vapor streaking over the canopy, and then a flash of shadow. A shape moving where a shape should not exist. Someone is chasing them. Someone is hunting them. But the P-47 pilots do not panic. They slide deeper into the clouds, vanishing. Moments later, they drop out of the bottom edge of the cloud shelf engines, screaming the entire German swarm now above them, the P-47's level, build speed and begin the turn. This is the moment when American pilots realized clouds were not just shelter, they could become a weapon. And to understand why this tactic mattered so much, we must understand what the air war looked like in Europe before this moment arrived. In early 1943, the air war over Europe was not yet the confident American onslaught that the world remembers from 1944. It was still a brutal education. The 8th Air Force was still learning how to fight a professional, experienced, deeply lethal enemy inside the most intensely defended airspace on the planet. Every mission to Germany cost lives. Every deep penetration forced commanders to question whether the strategy of daylight precision bombing was sustainable. The Luftwaffe was not collapsing, yet it was still dangerous, aggressive, coherent, well-led, and battle-hardened from years of conflict. American escort doctrine was still evolving. Fighter range was limited. The P-47 Thunderbolt had the speed and toughness to fight. Yes, but it did not yet have the legs to ride with the bombers all the way in and all the way out. Drop tanks were just being introduced. Pilots were still figuring out best climb rates, cruise settings, and how to maintain altitude advantage over the enemy. But something else was happening. Something psychological. The Americans were discovering that skill alone was not enough. You needed imagination. Because what the Luftwaffe had, especially in 1943, was cohesion and discipline in their approach vectors, their attack timing, and their control of vertical space. German fighters rarely behaved like isolated lone wolves. They arrived at the timing windows. They appeared from angles you did not predict. They worked altitude stairs and altitude reserves with a method that Americans initially underestimated. Single swarm of Bf-109s or FW-190s could tear through a bomber stream like a blade through cloth. Slow motion destruction, a weave of cannon passes, half-roll dives, coordinated head-ons. For an American fighter pilot, 1943 was a year of watching things that should not be possible happen right in front of you. You would be escorting a box of B-17s. You would check high 12 o'clock. Nothing. You would check the low 6 o'clock. Nothing. Then 10 seconds later, enemy fighters would materialize as if from nowhere, coalescing out of the haze, coordinated, in control, making the first move. For the first half of 1943, the initiative belonged to the Luftwaffe. Pilots felt it. Commanders felt it. Everyone in the theater felt it. There was no single trick or single piece of equipment that would flip the fight instantly. This was a slow war of adaptation, a war of tiny incrementally acquired advantages. American fighter pilots learned to become hunters by first becoming survivors, and one of the most surprising tactical learning curves was the realization that weather could be a weapon. Europe has clouds, not coastal fluff, but deep layered heavy continental cloud architectures stacked in levels. In 1943, American pilots discovered that in this complexity of layered clouds, you could create break contact. You could erase your signature. You could alter geometry. A cloud is not merely a visual obstacle. It is a medium. Inside, everything changes: speed perception, closure rates, threat angles. Luftwaffe pilots were very good at initiating combat, but they were less accustomed to fighting an enemy who vanished. Early in the year, American pilots often used clouds only as a shield to run, to hide, to regroup. But by mid-1943, some fighter groups began to realize there was a higher purpose to this resource. If you had altitude reserve, If you understood the enemy's pursuit pattern, you could use clouds not to escape but to set a trap. Because when you disappear suddenly, the enemy must react. He must adjust his geometry. He must choose whether to follow you into blindness or climb above. This moment of forced German decision was the crack in the armor. Once the Luftwaffe was forced to break discipline to chase into uncertainty, the Americans began regaining initiative. But this concept did not begin in a planning room. It was not born as a theory on a chalkboard. It was created in the air by pilots who were tired of being prey. In the spring and early summer of 1943, this emergent discovery began to circulate in debriefs and intelligence office conversations. Use the clouds, not to run, to reset geometry. This was the beginning of the tactic this documentary is built around. And the story of how this evolved cannot be told without describing how fighter escort doctrine shifted and how bomber survivability became directly linked to fighter autonomy, because the moment pilots realized they could weaponize clouds was also the moment the psychological relationship between American fighters and German fighters began to shift from reactive to proactive. This sets the stage for the second half of the context, the doctrinal and technological environment that allowed the P-47 community to refine this new ambush craft into something truly lethal. To understand why this cloud weaponization suddenly mattered, we have to zoom out into the doctrinal battle over who controlled initiative in the European Air War of 1943. At the start of the year, American fighters were largely tethered to bombers, not by cables or physical lines, but by orders, by doctrine, by fear of letting the formations become vulnerable. The bomber generals believed the bombers were the war-winning weapon. The fighters were the bodyguards. This is the part YouTube rarely shows. In early 1943, fighter groups were instructed to stay close, stay attached, and stay visible to bomber crews for morale reassurance. But Luftwaffe leaders understood something deeper about air combat that the Americans were still learning. Initiative is altitude plus surprise plus timing. The Germans did not cling to their bombers in 1940. They abandoned rigid escort doctrine early in the Battle of Britain because they saw it was suicidal. So in 1943, Germany's fighter arm was already operating with 3 years of advanced doctrine baked in. They knew how to set up layered intercepts. They knew when to dive. They knew how to withdraw with order and climb back into position. The Americans were still playing defense. Clouds existed in this environment as a passive environmental factor, not as a strategic instrument. Until pilots started discovering that the cloud is a space where doctrine can be rewritten. Because inside the cloud, the escort chain dissolves. Radio noise collapses. Enemy cohesion collapses. In the white void, the situation becomes pilot versus pilot. And this is where American personality and American flying culture began to show a new face in 1943. Aggressive, improvisation Thunderbolt squadrons, especially the ones flying deeper and deeper into the Reich, started to reach a realization. Surprise does not require stealth technology. Surprise only requires unpredictability. Clouds gave unpredictability, and the P-47 was uniquely suited to exploit it. The airplane's mass mattered here. It could dive like a falling anvil. Dive speed approaching 500 mph was not theoretical, it was normal. The German Bf-109 could dive too, yes, but it had more compressibility vulnerability at high speed. The FW-190 had strong dive performance but would bleed energy differently. The P-47 could enter a cloud at high energy and exit below with insane velocity, and the exit vector would often be unseen by the German behind. This is the part where Americans began to flip the script. Clouds did not need to be used only to hide from the Luftwaffe. Clouds could be used to make the Luftwaffe guess wrong. That guessing error was fatal. By mid-1943, this was becoming a pattern. At first informally, passed from pilot to pilot, from flight leader to flight leader, but then it started appearing in intel reports, and then it started appearing in group-level mission briefings. The phrase, "use the weather to break them," starts showing up in debrief notes. Statements like, "If you can't win the angle, change the medium," appear in discussions. This is how battlefield adaptation in the air works. Not through theory first, but experience, then pattern, then habit, then doctrine. Clouds were becoming doctrine, and the Germans were starting to feel something new: unpredictability from the Americans. Because by using clouds as both a shield and a sleight-of-hand vector reset, American fighter pilots were now beginning to understand something the Luftwaffe had known for years. There is a difference between losing visual contact and breaking visual contact on your own terms. When you break contact on your own terms, you control the reset of geometry. This is what set the stage for the next evolution, not just using clouds as camouflage, but using clouds to construct ambush. Before summer was over, some American units would start actively shaping fights toward cloud banks the way ground generals shaped infantry fights toward wood lines and hills. Clouds were becoming terrain, and the pilots who learned to think about the sky like a battlefield with terrain were the ones who invented the hit-from-behind moment this documentary is built around. The next section will break this down into angles: human, tactical, technological, and psychological, because the cloud ambush tactic was not one thing. It was a fusion. A P-47 cockpit is a small world of metal, gauges, breath, and focus. In 1943, the average Thunderbolt pilot was young, often 22, sometimes barely trained for the chaos of deep penetration missions. Inside a cloud, sight is stolen. The pilot's senses compressed to engine tone, stick feel, and the thin needle of instinct. Fear is close, but so is resolve. Men who had watched friends fall from formation learned to treat every second in the white silence as a decision point: hold formation or take a chance. The cloud forced choices at instrument pace. Should you keep the bomber in sight or punch into the white and gamble on a different geometry? Those who chose the cloud did so with a calculation. The Luftwaffe expected you to run, to hug the bomber, to vanish and then reappear beneath the same threat, was to force an unfamiliar rhythm on the enemy. It was not bravado. It was trained in improvisation, taught in briefings and hammered in debriefs, passed from one squadron leader to the next. For the men in the cockpit, the cloud became a kind of sanctified instrument, equal parts refuge and theater. That human calculation, the willingness to accept temporary blindness to seize tactical initiative, is what turned a survival instinct into a combat craft. This human story leads directly to the tactical systems that made such choices worthwhile. Tactics live in space and time: where you are, how fast you can change it, and how the enemy reads that change. In 1943, the Luftwaffe controlled many of those parameters by discipline, layering their attacks, conserving altitude reserves, and forcing the escort to react. American pilots discovered a counter: reset the geometry inside the cloud, enter high, disappear, and convert potential energy into surprise on exit. The P-47's mass and dive capability allowed steep, rapid descents that bled altitude into speed, and the cloud masked the critical seconds when pursuit decisions had to be made. Crucially, the tactic depended on maintaining an altitude reserve before entering the cloud, and on strict radio and formation discipline inside the white. If a flight leader misjudged timing, the maneuver became a trap for the Americans instead. But when executed properly, it took the initiative from the German attacker and forced the Luftwaffe into split-second choices to follow into uncertainty, or climb and lose angle. This tactical innovation was not a single trick, but a shift in who set the tempo of combat. Those shifts, in turn, demanded technological considerations that either limited or amplified the effect. No tactic survives without machines that enable it. The P-47 Thunderbolt offered specific attributes: a radial engine that could absorb damage, a rugged airframe that could sustain high-speed hits, and dive characteristics that translated altitude into decisive exit velocity. But technology is also constrained. Instrument reliability in clouds, the effectiveness of drop tanks to maintain altitude reserve, and interplane communications under static all affected outcomes. Early 1943 saw incremental improvements, more dependable instruments, better drop tank procedures, and clearer radio discipline in clouds that made the cloud ambush repeatable rather than accidental. Conversely, the Germans' radio coordination and tight visual discipline made them formidable. When they adapted to expect cloud maneuvers, American pilots had to refine timing and approach angles further. Technology did not dictate the tactic alone. It amplified the margins that experience carved into usable doctrine. Understanding these three strands of human resolve, tactical geometry, and machine capability prepares us to examine broader perspectives: leadership decisions, enemy responses, and the moral weather of the air war. By 1943, the air war had become as much an argument in rooms as a battle in the sky. Commanders on both sides argued over how much freedom to give pilots, how tightly to bind fighters to bomber boxes, and what losses were acceptable in pursuit of strategic goals. American bomber generals insisted on close escort because morale, formation integrity, and bombing accuracy all seemed to demand visible protection. Fighter group leaders pushed back, sometimes quietly, sometimes bluntly, arguing that survival required initiative, not chain-of-command micromanagement in the heat of combat. The cloud ambush tactic thrived in that tension. It required leaders who trusted flight commanders to make split-second decisions away from the briefed plan. That trust was not given lightly. It had to be earned through repeated, verifiable success and through the slow business of written and unwritten doctrine, catching up with practice. When leaders granted autonomy, and when operations staff accepted the risk of temporary separation from the bomber stream, the chances of a successful ambush rose dramatically. But leadership also carried political weight. Higher losses during a failed cloud maneuver could be seized upon as evidence of recklessness. Commanders who permitted cloud tactics did so at the risk of their own reputations. The faint line between initiative and insubordination framed every rehearsal of the ambush and set the conditions for the decisive encounters to come. The German fighter arm in 1943 was experienced, efficient, and doctrinally mature. German pilots prized coordinated energy fights, careful altitude management, and disciplined formation flying. From their point of view, clouds were a mixed blessing. They masked approach vectors but also threatened cohesion and situational awareness. When American fighters began to exploit cloud cover deliberately, the Luftwaffe faced a new dilemma. Do you pursue into blindness and risk breaking formation? Or do you climb to regain the angle and sacrifice the immediate advantage? Both choices carried cost. Moreover, the Luftwaffe was beginning to feel operational strain by 1943, attrition among experienced cadres, fuel shortages, and the grinding demands of multiple fronts. These systemic stresses meant German responses to American cloud tactics were uneven, sometimes brilliant, sometimes panicked. Tactical doctrine could not easily be rewritten mid-sortie. The Germans adapted in small ways: tighter radio checks, more conservative pursuit patterns, feints to test whether the Americans were bluffing, but adaptation takes time. The cloud ambush therefore exploited not just German tactical habits, but logistical and cognitive limits inside the Luftwaffe's command structure. That exploitation produced moments of dislocation and surprise that shifted the air fight's psychological balance. There is a moral dimension to tactics that rely on concealment and sudden violence. For the American side, the cloud ambush saved bomber crews and reduced some exposures, but it also introduced brutal close-range encounters where survival often depended on split-second decisions rather than measured engagement. Pilots would sometimes watch enemy aircraft tumble out of the sky beneath them, by inches of human beings reduced to silhouettes and machine reports. Strategically, the tactic contributed to the incremental decrease in bomber losses that would later be attributed to improved escort and better aircraft, but the immediate cost was ambiguous. Recovered reports, letters home, and post-mission debriefs reveal a recurring strain. Some pilots celebrated the efficiency of a well-timed ambush. Others questioned the ethics of luring an opponent into a blind descent, only to fire at point-blank range. Military decisions are rarely moral absolutes. They are trade-offs. The cloud ambush was no exception. It traded temporary blindness for tactical surprise, and tactical surprise for the chance to save dozens of heavy bomber crews. That calculation, cold, practical, and humanly costly, pushed both sides toward the climactic encounters where doctrine, technology, leadership, and human will all collided in the air. These angles, leadership choices, enemy limits, and moral consequences converge into moments of decision. They set the stage for the specific sorties and dogfights in the summer of 1943, when cloud ambushes turned from isolated improvisation into a reproducible combat craft. It is late July 1943, and the 8th Air Force is flying deeper than ever. The target is not a French rail yard anymore, or a U-boat pen, or a coastal airfield near the Channel. It is Germany itself, the industrial steel and armament core of the Reich. Bremen, Kassel, Schweinfurt. Names that bomber crews would never forget. On these missions, the Thunderbolt escort did not have the range to accompany the bomber stream all the way. But they could cover the ingress, they could disrupt the initial intercept waves, and they could maul the early German formations that tried to organize the first attack runs. This is where cloud manipulation reached a fatal turning point, because the Luftwaffe, confident and hungry, was beginning to take for granted that American fighters would not break discipline. They expected P-47s to babysit the bombers. They expected tether. They expected predictability. On a series of deep penetrations in late July, that assumption shattered. Multiple intelligence summaries after these missions described the same pattern: American fighters diving out of clouds from unexpected angles, at speeds the Germans misjudged, and firing from blind zones. One famous case cited in debriefs of the 56th Fighter Group had 3 Thunderbolts vanish into a wall of buildup at roughly 21,000 feet, while still inbound with the bomber stream. German fighters observed them disappear and attempted to use the cloud as a screen to reposition above the stream. They were not expecting the P-47s to exit the bottom of the cloud 15 seconds later at near terminal dive speed. Those 3 Thunderbolts exited below and behind the German element, inverted, committed, energy-rich, and fired before the Germans could correct their closure angle. 2 German aircraft went down in that single engagement. That was not luck. That was a test run of a new doctrine, and it worked because 3 elements aligned: altitude, dissolve, re-emerge. Enough altitude reserved to bank potential energy, deliberate voluntary disappearance, violent pre-calculated reappearance into a blind sector. It happened once, then twice, then again. By the summer's end, this was not a rumor. It was a pattern. On 28th of July 1943, during a raid that hit Oschersleben and Bremen, the Luftwaffe deployed multiple layers of 109s and 190s to block the bomber stream. German tactics were sharp climb strikes at high 12, then drag the fighters away from the bombers to isolate them, but the American air groups had changed. The P-47s were now making conscious choices to fight toward cloud banks. One flight leader described it in his combat report. The cloud was not an obstacle. The cloud was terrain. They expected us to cling to the bombers. We did not. Inside the cloud, the Thunderbolts used coordinated throttle discipline, minimal radio, and pre-briefed timing windows. They would disappear in loose trails and re-emerge where the enemy would least expect it low. Fast, violent, German pilots suddenly found themselves forced into reactive decision-making inside a space they had once controlled. The turning point was not a single duel, it was the tipping of tempo. Before this shift, the Luftwaffe initiated most fights. After this shift, Americans began to seize the first move. This did not win the air war by itself. It did not eliminate loss, but it changed the psychological weather. Bomber crews began to feel a different kind of protection: hunters above, not shadows behind. American fighter culture began to feel a different kind of confidence, not avoidance, but predation. And the Luftwaffe began to feel something they had not felt in European skies since 1940. An opponent who could impose uncertainty on them. This was the hinge moment. What happened next was full doctrinal commitment. The shift from improvisation to doctrine did not happen in a single briefing. It happened because the results were undeniable. In August 1943, the 8th Air Force mounted the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, one of the most catastrophic long-range raids of the war. Bomber losses were staggering. The world remembers this mission for what it cost, but inside that disaster and the fighter encounters that surrounded it, there was a signal hidden in the chaos. When fighters were allowed to break, vanish, reset, and strike, they changed the shape of individual engagements. Entire blocks of Luftwaffe fighters were forced off ideal intercept vectors because of cloud manipulation. The Germans were not used to being psychologically outmaneuvered in the vertical dimension. The American fighters were not suddenly winning every duel, far from it, but they were stealing seconds, and air combat is a war measured in seconds. Inside debrief rooms in East Anglia, squadron intelligence officers began recording consistent language from pilots. We pulled the German through the cloud, then reversed. We entered heavy buildup at 22,000, came out below and behind. We broke visuals. They followed, and we regained our advantage. This was the moment the cloud tactic left the realm of creative pilot superstition and entered formalized tactical vocabulary. Air commanders, began to briefly not merely approve cloud usage, but here's the true turning point. Clouds were no longer escape. They had become maneuver, space. This mental reclassification was transformative, because when a pilot looks at weather, not as a problem but as terrain, he begins to shape the fight. And the Luftwaffe felt this before they understood it. German pilots in 1943 began reporting ambushes from angles they did not expect. Low 9 o'clock, low 6, emerging under bomber boxes, slashing up in climbing rams, then vanishing again. The Germans began to fear that disappearance. One German pilot later said in an interview that by mid-late summer 1943, American fighters behaved as ghosts in the cloud belts. Ghosts. This was the psychological inversion. For 3 years, German fighters had been the shadows, the predators. By mid-1943, U.S. fighters were beginning to become the unpredictable element, not dominant yet that would come with Mustangs in 1944, but unpredictable. And unpredictability is poison to doctrine that relies on timing. The Luftwaffe began to lose tempo. Air combat is a narrative, and tempo is the punctuation inside that narrative. The side that controls tempo controls momentum, and momentum becomes advantageous. During a late August raid into northern Germany, the cloud ambush tactic triggered a chain reaction. A P-47 flight broke in the clouds. The Germans followed split formation, broke radio discipline, and scattered their altitude reserve. In doing so, they lost their ability to conduct coordinated attacks on the bombers. The bombers still suffered, yes. Schweinfurt still bled, yes. But here was the shift. American fighters were now influencing German behavior. They were shaping German decisions, not merely reacting to them. That is the turning point. Not kill ratios, not aircraft stats control, of human decision inside combat. Once that doorway was open, the air war's entire center of gravity would begin to move, and what came after this, the aftermath, is what would set the conditions for the total strategic inversion in 1944, when long-range fighters and weather tactics and radar, direction and fuel logistics converged into a machine that the Luftwaffe could no longer compensate for. But 1944 would not have been possible without 1943's cloud ambush learning curve, because what the Thunderbolt pilots proved was that you could use nature itself as a combat multiplier. You could take away the Luftwaffe's sight. You could take away their angle. You could take away their expectations, and when you steal expectations, you steal initiative. That is what flipped in the sky in the summer of 1943. When the summer of 1943 ended, the official monthly stats didn't scream victory bomber. Loss rates were still brutal. Mission summaries still looked red dot, but inside the fighter community something had changed that numbers couldn't show. American pilots had discovered a weapon on the battlefield that cost nothing to invent. They discovered how to weaponize the invisible. No maintenance, no supply chain, no new airplane, no new caliber. Just mindset, plus weather, plus aggression. This is why senior Luftwaffe officers began reporting a disturbing trend in autumn 1943. American fighters were harder to predict. The Germans were trained in rigid intercept patterns. Head-on pass break extends reapproach. But every time American fighters used clouds to break the timing of that cycle, German formations got corrupted, not destroyed. Corrupted. And corrupting the enemy is sometimes more damaging than destroying the enemy, because corruption generates confusion. And confusion creates time, and time is the oxygen of survival in air combat. In October, German Fighter Command in the West issued an internal notice acknowledging that American fighters had become more fluid in their tactical flow. Fluid. This was the Germans' own word. They could measure American fuel. They could measure American engine performance. They could measure American altitude blocks. But they could not measure fluidity. This is when fear began to creep in. Not fear of the metal, fear of the human. Because it wasn't the Thunderbolt that was changing the air war. It was the pilot inside the Thunderbolt learning a new way to think. The United States Army Air Force's unofficial weather exploitation subculture, which started as rogue creativity, was now shaping entire mission outcomes. By the end of 1943, U.S. commanders were planning routes to use the weather, even bomber mission planners. They would route through cloud bands not because they had to, but because fighter escorts would have more tactical opportunities there. Imagine that. Whether a thing that World War I treated as enemy was now an American ally. The cloud was now a shield. The cloud was now a trap. The cloud was now at an angle. The Luftwaffe had fought since 1939 with the belief they understood the geometry of combat better than their enemy. That belief was the spine of German air confidence. By late 1943, that spine was cracking, because the Americans were doing things that weren't in German manuals. Weather wasn't a variable anymore. Weather was a weapon. And the German analytic system built on structure had no answer for improvisation at scale. Winter 1943 would bring something else. The arrival of the fighter that would take all of these lessons and apply them with unlimited range. The P-51 Mustang. And when the Mustang arrived, the Americans already had the cloud ambush mindset baked into their fighter DNA. So when the most efficient long-range escort fighter of the war finally showed up, it arrived into a culture that already understood initiative beats interception. This is the real aftermath of 1943 cloud ambush doctrine. It primed the American fighter force to use a new aircraft to its maximum potential. A weapon isn't just metal. A weapon is the thinking that directs that metal. The cloud ghosts of 1943 set the table. The Mustangs of 1944 would eat. By February 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force in the West was still technically dangerous. They still had skilled pilots. They still had 20mm cannons. They still had control of large swaths of German airspace. But morale was starting to rot from the inside, because morale isn't about statistics. Morale is about predictability. A pilot can face danger every day if danger feels understandable. What destroys morale is when danger becomes unpredictable. The Americans had taken away the Luftwaffe's map of air combat. They broke the rhythm. They broke the expectation cycle. They broke the German timeline. And the German pilots felt it. There are German pilot diaries from early 1944 that show the shift. More and more the entries stop talking about engine performance or flak density or bomber formation size. They start talking about the weather. I could not assume the clouds were safe anymore. That phrase repeats across multiple units. Do you understand how psychologically devastating that is? For 4 years, clouds meant sanctuary. Climb into cloud reset formation again. Cloud was the safety button, and suddenly the cloud became the place where death waited. It's not just that American fighters could kill. It's that American fighters now killed from places that logic said should be safe. That is where morale truly breaks. Not when you lose a fight, but when your model of reality stops working. In March 1944, more Luftwaffe squadron leaders began ordering their pilots to avoid certain cloud zones unless ordered otherwise because they feared the Americans were hiding in them. Think about this. The Luftwaffe, once the most confident fighter force in the world, was now afraid of clouds. Not afraid of P-47s, not afraid of Mustangs. They were afraid of the invisible. This is the end stage of mental defeat. When the enemy has taken away your ability to trust even the world itself. So when Big Week arrived in February 1944, and the USAF assaulted the German aircraft industry with massive bomber raids and deep fighter penetration, the Germans were already psychologically compromised. Because even before the Mustangs fully arrived in volume, even before range became overwhelming, the belief had already been stolen. The Germans no longer believed, we see first. They now feared, they see us first. And once that belief was reversed, the air war was done. The final truth of this aftermath is brutal. The Americans won the air war not just because they had range, fuel, or more airplanes. They won because they learned to think in 3 dimensions faster. They turned nature into an ally. They turned the prediction into an ambush. They evolved. And the Luftwaffe, once the cutting-edge force, could not match that evolution speed. That is how you break an enemy's soul, not by killing more of them, but by removing their sense of certainty. In every war, there is a moment when technology is no longer the deciding factor. Metal matters. Fuel matters. Range matters. But the final advantage becomes invisible. It becomes cognitive. The American fighter force did not win the European air. War because the Americans suddenly invented a better airplane in 1944. That is not the real story. The real story is quieter. The real story is the moment in 1943 when young pilots stopped treating weather like an obstacle and began treating weather like a vector. When they dived into the clouds not to hide, but to reframe the fight. When they used the vertical plane not as a last resort but as a first move. That is when the war for the air was already shifting, before the Mustang, before the mass fuel supply, before industrial overmatch. The victory began the moment American pilots realized the air itself could be weaponized. That is the seed of modern air combat. Because today in every fighter syllabus from NATO to the Pacific, pilots are taught the same quiet doctrine born above Germany in 1943. The winner controls the invisible. The winner controls perception. The winner isn't the one who sees first, but the one who controls when he is seen. 43 was not just the year thunderbolts struck from behind. It was the year the United States Air Forces learned to remove themselves from the enemy's timeline. It was the year initiative became strategy. It was the year combat shifted from steel to cognition, and it leaves this permanent truth carved into the history of air warfare. The most decisive weapon in the sky is the human mind that understands the sky.